Guys, it's Aiden. I'm back with another video. Today we're going to be doing the Science ACT full guide, and I know this has been a very highly requested topic in the past, so we're finally going to be doing it. And just a heads up, this is probably going to be the longest video and the most detailed guide I've made on any ACT subject, so I recommend you pay extra attention and take notes. And I'll give you the personal guarantee, okay? This video is going to be maybe like 20-30 minutes long, but I'll give you the guarantee that if you lock in and pay attention for this video, I will be able to raise your score, okay? Now, with that being said, let's address the elephant in the room, and that is the new ACT changes that are coming to September. And if you aren't aware of this, I would highly recommend you watch my video, which I did on the new enhanced ACT changes, I guess. But basically, the entire structure of the ACT test is changing, and science is taking the biggest hit, right? So the science section is becoming completely optional, but I highly recommend, and if you probably clicked on this video, you guys are probably taking the science section. So it's very beneficial for STEM, especially if you're interested in majoring in anything in STEM. So I highly recommend you take it, but it becoming optional is not the only thing that has changed. The timing has also changed. So usually you had 35 minutes to answer 40 questions. Now you have 40 minutes to answer 40 questions. So you're getting around 1 minute per question now, right? So it's a slight add to the time. And there have actually been some structural content changes that not many people know about. So the first change in the content is that they're adding more questions that require background knowledge, right? So if you're not familiar with background knowledge questions, usually in the science ACT test, there are around 4 questions that require some sort of science background knowledge that you learn in chemistry or biology, right? A really common example of this is the pH scale, right? You need to know, 7 is a neutral, right? And anything lower is acidic and anything higher is a base. So that's kind of like a background knowledge, a very common background knowledge concept that's tested on the science ACT section. But basically what they're doing for the new science ACT is that they're increasing the number of questions that require some level of background knowledge. So usually it was 4. I'm assuming they'll maybe raise it to 6 or 8 questions that require a lot more background knowledge. So later on in the video, I'll cover all the concepts and topics that you need to know about background knowledge in the science section of the ACT. The second change that they're adding to the ACT science section is now they're making a guarantee that one of the passages on the ACT science section is going to be about experimental design. And if you've taken AP Physics, AP Chem, or AP Bio, you should know what experimental design is, right? And that's basically the procedures of setting up an experiment. So this is like knowing what an independent and dependent variable is. It's like knowing what an experimental versus control group is, right? It's like setting a research question and setting a hypothesis, that kind of stuff, right? So just be wary of that and know all the processes that go in to experimental design and what it takes to set up an experiment. Okay, now that I've gone over all the changes in the science section for the new and enhanced ACT, let's talk about my strategy and how I would like you guys to approach the science section. So the science section isn't really about science, to be honest. It's more of a reading test. So how I like to think about it is science is basically a reading for math, okay? You don't really need to, you could be dumb as rocks and fail all your science classes and you could still probably score pretty decent on the science section if you just know how to read and identify data and information quickly. And that requires a lot of practice, right? So we'll do that a little later, but there are some strategies that can help you achieve that level of data identification way quicker. So my first strategy is never ever read the passage first, okay? Always start with the questions. And that's something I've done, through my entire ACT test taking time. And I've never read the passage first, okay? I've always dived straight to question 1 because usually the passages are about some bullshit that to be honest, I don't even know what they're talking about, okay? Nobody really knows what they're talking about. They could be talking about some super advanced stuff and you wouldn't know, okay? The point is, the questions ask about specific parts of that passage. You don't have to understand the whole passage as a whole. You just need to understand what the question is asking you and where you can find what that question is asking you in the passage, okay? And I'll go over some examples later in the video. But that's my biggest thing. Okay, never read the passages, never go straight into the passage. Always start with the questions. Another thing about the science ACT section is that it's very repetitive. They put out the same types of passages and questions almost every single year. So I want to familiarize you guys with three different types of passages. So I'm gonna be looking at my phone because I took my notes on here. So just bear with me. Okay. So the first type of passage is just hard data. They're just gonna throw graphs at you. They're gonna throw scatter plots, charts, whatever. It's gonna be different types of data ways to represent data, and they're just going to throw that at you, right? And the questions are just going to be asking like, when X is something, what is Y, right? So the answer to all these types of questions that involve, graphs and data is like, you should be able to put a finger on, a part of the graph or passage, and you'd be able to derive your answer from that. So it's really about, finding the right graph to look at, because sometimes they have multiple. So a really good tip is that sometimes in the question, they'll be like, oh, in study one or in graph one, according to table A. So don't ignore everything else. Just look at what the question is telling you to, okay? Because that's where you're going to find your answer. So don't waste your time looking at other stuff. Listen to the question. So that's the first type of passage, and that's the data representation passage. So the second type of passage is the research summaries passage, and basically it's kind of similar to the first type, but it's going to be focused on a specific experiment or research, right? So you'll see graphs and you'll see tables and you'll see numbers, but there's going to be a lot more context and kind of like a narrative around the passage, right? So the most common questions that you might see for this passage is the hypothetical question, right? So for example, if there was like a change into this experiment, right? So say if it was conducted at this one temperature, but you lowered the temperature, you'd be asked to infer what the results might be based on like the information given in the passage. The second type of question that you might see for this passage is the interpreting results or interpreting experiments question, right? So for example, like somebody could claim this, and you'd be asked to say like, would the results like prove it or disprove it? And it'd be like, yes because X, no because X, yes because Y, no because Y. So those are kind of like the two most common questions for this passage. The third passage type is the conflicting viewpoints passage, and this one is where there's basically multiple students or scientists, each with like a slightly different hypothesis to like an experiment or something. And your job is to kind of figure out like what are the differences in opinion between each of the students or scientists, right? So the most common questions that you're going to see for this passage is like understanding viewpoints. Say for example, the question might ask you, based on student like 3, like say student 3 is correct, then what would the result of the experiment be, right? So given that student 3's hypothesis is correct, what would the result be, or something like that. Basically it's to kind of like test you, like, do you know what the student is talking about? Do you know what their hypothesis is? The second type of question is going to be kind of comparing the viewpoints, right? So they're going to be asking you like, if this was the result of the experiment, which students' viewpoints does the experiment support? Which do they refute, kind of thing. So now that we've covered the passage types, let's look at some of the mistakes that people kind of make, right? And I think the top one mistake that most people make on the science section is they get caught up in detail, right? Now, don't get me wrong, detail is important, but too much detail can really harm you. So let me give you an example. Like for the conflicting viewpoints passage, right? Usually there's like 4 students or 4 different scientists with different viewpoints. Sometimes the question doesn't even ask about like one of the students. Like for example, the entire passage could like go past without even asking about like student 3 at all, right? And if you wasted time like reading student 3's viewpoint, right, and like understanding it, then you've kind of like wasted all that time for nothing, because it's not even going to show up in the questions. So again, just going back to the previous piece of advice, always read the question first before diving into the passage, okay? Don't waste your time, because the science section is super long. There's a ton of information in the passages. They don't expect you to understand it all. They don't expect you to even read it all, to be honest. Like sometimes I be going through the passages, and there are like entire chunks of paragraphs that I don't even read. But I've managed to finish all the questions because the questions don't ask about every single part of the passage. Only pick out the specific parts of the passage that the questions are asking about and study those, okay? Because this is a time crunch, right? You only get 1 minute per question. So you got to make sure you optimize time and don't get stuck behind. Another thing that the ACT really likes to do is they just want to confuse you, okay? I mean, that's just how it is, all right? That's standardized testing. You got to get used to it. But basically what they'll do is, they'll throw out chemicals with super long names that you've never heard of, right? They'll throw out diseases with insanely complex spelling or whatever. Stuff you've never heard about, okay? Quite frankly, like you probably never heard about a lot of the stuff that the ACT science section is talking about. And that's okay. That's how the test was designed to be, right? It's designed to confuse you, but it's really testing you again, not on science, but taking the necessary data from the passage and applying it to the questions, right? So you don't need to know all these complex chemicals, whatever bullshit that the ACT likes to throw. You just got to know what the question is asking you. And usually it's asking you about pretty simple and elementary stuff that's literally written in the passage, okay? So don't get overwhelmed by, complex formulas or, different whatever's phenomenons or whatever. Like it doesn't matter. Like just focus on what the question is asking you, and it's going to be pretty simple, okay? So simplicity is key. Okay, now that I've gone over some of my tips, strategies, and common mistakes that you might make, let's go back to the background knowledge part, right? And I know earlier in the video I emphasized that they're increasing the number of questions that are using background knowledge. So I'll kind of go through everything that you need to know for background knowledge. And I believe these are the notes that I took from when I was studying from the ACT. So straight from the source, right? And I think I got this from Prep Scholar or somewhere. So I'll probably link the source in the description. But I'll kind of go through each of them. I think the Prep Scholar article did a very detailed job. A lot of this stuff you probably won't have to know. Like maybe there's 18 topics, and out of these 18, I've seen maybe 5 or 6, right? So you don't have to study them super intensely, but I'll make sure to let you know which topics are super important. So I'll kind of just go down the list, get a pen, pencil out, something, take notes. So, all right, the first part is going to be cell biology, right? So this is knowing what organelles are. So what the difference between animal cells, plant cells, knowing, what a chloroplast is and, how it handles photosynthesis. Mitochondria is for animal cells. Literally that's all you need to know for cell biology. If you want to go overboard, you can get the functions of all the organelles, but I didn't do that. So, another thing, you need to know that the nucleus stores DNA, and that's basically it. The second part is DNA, RNA, and ribosome. So basically knowing that DNA is the blueprint to make proteins, right? And then mRNA is basically what copies it. I want to say that mRNA is important. Just know DNA is the blueprint, right? And then ribosomes are basically, what makes the proteins. The third topic is going to be natural selection, right? And I mean, this is pretty common knowledge. Natural selection is traits. If you have a favorable trait, you're more likely to survive and reproduce, leading to, that trait being passed down more likely to the next generation. Greenhouse gases. I've never had any experience with greenhouse gases on any of my tests, but just what I had in notes, it's just carbon dioxide, methane, ozone, whatever. It traps heat and causes warming. I've never had a test where greenhouse gases were mentioned, but if you want to study that, you can. The fifth point is photosynthesis and respiration. So photosynthesis basically, makes glucose and oxygen, and respiration breaks down glucose into ATP energy. So respiration is basically you're breathing, and then photosynthesis is basically what takes the carbon dioxide and creates, oxygen for you to breathe. So just know that cycle. If you take AP Bio, this should be a breeze for you. The next one is taxonomic rank. I've never had any tests or questions asked about this. I won't even bother studying this for this, to be honest. So this basically like knowing the difference between a kingdom, an order, a class, a family, what a species, genus, that type of stuff. But to be honest, I don't know to this day, so I think you'll be fine if you skip it. The seventh one is genetics. So this is basically like alleles. So dominant versus recessive. If you know Punnett squares, you should be fine, right? So, big T, little t, whatever. Um, just make sure you get that down and know what a dominant and recessive trait is. The eighth topic is going to be basic molecular structure. Um, I've never had any tests ask about this, so I wouldn't really worry about it. But basically, this is like knowing what sugars are made out of, right? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and then knowing like proteins have nitrogen and nucleic acids have phosphorus. I mean, that's kind of it. I haven't experienced a test or question that ever asked about this, so the ninth point is going to be freezing and boiling points of water. This is very important. This comes out very frequently. Remember, 0 degrees Celsius is going to be the freezing point. Anything over 100 degrees or 100 degrees is going to be the boiling point. You just have to know that. Okay, next, the 10th topic is going to be the pH scale. And this is another very, very important one that comes out very frequently. So anything below 7 on the pH scale is going to be acidic. Above 7 is going to be a base. And 7 is going to be neutral. The next topic is going to be molar mass, and that's basically the concept that heavier molecules are going to weigh more because they have more atoms. So for example, like oxygen, which is O2, is going to be lighter than carbon dioxide, which is CO2, because carbon dioxide has that extra carbon on it, so it's going to weigh more. The next topic is going to be how charges interact, and this is probably another important one that you should know. Remember, you should know what an electron, neutron, proton is. Just know that opposites attract and likes repel. So just know that and you should be good. The 13th topic is going to be phase changes, right? So this is another very important one that I would make sure to get down. So phase changes are basically, solids, liquids, gas, stuff like that. And remember, they're changing from different states of matter without altering the chemical composition, right? Some of the key terms that you should know are like melting, which is from solid to liquid, freezing, which is from liquid to solid, vaporization, which is liquid to gas, and then condensation, which is gas to liquid, sublimation, which is solid to gas, and disposition, which is gas to solid. The last two is probably going to be used a lot less frequently, but I would just know them just to be safe. Okay, the 14th topic is going to be gravity, right? So just knowing the concept of gravity, it doesn't tell you I know if you've taken physics, gravity is minus 9.8, whatever. Like it doesn't test you about that. You just need to know like the concept of gravity and how it's like a downward pulling force. Topic 15 is going to be the density formula, and you just got to know this. This is density equals mass divided by volume. So just get that down. Topic 16 is density rules. So basically this is like denser objects sink, less denser objects will float. And it's all relative to the liquid you're in, right? So if the object is denser than the liquid, it'll sink. And if it's less denser than the liquid, it'll float. And just keep in mind, the liquid is not always water. So you got to be careful about that. Topic 17 is going to be kinetic versus potential energy. Kinetic energy is basically, when you're in motion, while potential energy is like stored up energy, right? So a really nice way I like to think about it is, if we have a pendulum, right, and I'm holding the ball up here, then it has a lot of potential energy because it's like the potential, right? When I let go, that potential energy gets converted into kinetic energy while it's in motion. So that's basically what you need to know. You don't need to know any formulas or whatever. Just know the concepts for that. All right, and the final topic, topic 18, is going to be basic math skills. And especially what I mean by that is scientific notation. So understanding how to read scientific notation, because a lot of the time numbers are going to be super big or super small. So usually they're going to be written in like times 10 to the something power, right? So knowing how to add or subtract or multiply and divide in scientific notation will be very, very helpful. Okay, so that's all the 18 topics that you might need to know for the Science ACT background knowledge, right? These were the things that I studied during my preparation, so I definitely could have forgotten something or made a mistake. So just let me know in the comments if you find something that I'm missing, and I'll make sure to like pin it or something so everybody can know. All right, now that we've covered all the AT and background knowledge topics on the science section, let's move on to actually doing a passage. So I'm going to put up some passages on the screen with questions, and you can either pause the video or I'll walk through my explanations and my thought processes, and you can kind of follow along. Also, I'm recording this on a different day. That's why I'm wearing a different shirt. All right, so the question should be up right now. Pause the video if you guys want to solve it first, or I'm just going to start diving into my explanations. So, like I said in my strategy, I would not read the passage first. I'd skip the entire passage, just go straight to question 20 and read question 20. So, question 20 says, based on table 1 and student 1's predictions, which pendulum will have the greater gravitational acceleration, P1 or P3? So, I'm just going to look at table 1 and student 1 and ignore everything else because that's what the question is asking about. So, let's go to table 1 and I can immediately see P1 and P3. So it seems like there's a mass and length in meters. So mass is in kilograms, length is in meters. And then I'll read the student 1. And okay, so it says, for a given L, as M increases, the gravitational force exerted by Earth on a sphere will increase. So the sphere weight will increase. As this weight increases, gravitational acceleration will increase. And that's exactly what we were looking for. The question asks, which will have the greater gravitational acceleration? And it tells us right there. As M increases, the weight increases, and that also means the gravitational acceleration will also increase. So that just means which one has a bigger weight, right? So we just simplified question 20 from all this complex stuff into, does P1 or P2 have the greater weight? So we can see on the table that P1 has a mass of 1 kilogram and P3 has a mass of 2 kilograms. So that means P3 will have the greater gravitational acceleration because it has the greater mass. And that is option choice H. All right, let's move on to question 21. Suppose that the spheres are removed from P2 and P4. And then the spheres are simultaneously dropped from a height of 5 meters above the ground. Based on table 1 and student 1's predictions, the spheres are more likely to strike the ground first. Will be the sphere removed from P2 or P4. All right, so again, it's asking about student 1's predictions and table 1. So let's go back to student 1 prediction and read the rest of that paragraph. So as weight increases, gravitational acceleration will increase, and that also means the average speed of the sphere is also increasing, right? And that will basically tell us our answer. If we drop two of the spheres, the one with the greater mass, right, is going to have a higher average speed over time, because that's what it says right here, according to student 1. I don't care whether it's true or whether it's false. I'm only looking at, what student 1 is saying. And according to what he's saying, the average speed is going to increase. That means whatever sphere has the higher mass is also going to hit the ground first. So again, let's look at table 1, and we can see that pendulum, or P2, has a mass of 1 and a P4 has a mass of 2. So that means P4 will hit the ground first. Because its average speed will be greater because it has a bigger mass. So that would be option choice C. All right, let's move on to question 22. Two pendulums, P5 and P6, had the same F. How would student 2 most likely explain this result? So let's immediately move to student 2 and read what he has to say. So M will not affect F, which is what we're looking for, right? We're looking for things that will affect F or make F be the same. So it's saying that mass will not affect F, according to student 2. Let's read the second paragraph, and it's saying as length increases, as a result, the pendulum will take more time to complete a cycle, so F will decrease. So that means as L changes, F will also change, but M will not affect F. And what we're looking for is P5 and P6 have the same F. So the possible explanation here is that the length has to be the same, because if the length are different, then F will be affected, as it says in the second paragraph. But two different m's will not affect the f. So we're looking ideally for P5 and P6 to have the same length. So that means that is option choice F. P5 and P6 have the same length. All right, let's move on to question 23. Based on table 1 and student 2's prediction, which pendulum will travel the greater distance over a cycle, P3 or P4? So let's move to student 2, table 1. So, okay. What we're looking for is which one will travel a greater distance over a cycle. So let's skim the text for greater distance or distance. There it is. For any given m, as length increases, the distance traveled by a sphere over a cycle will increase. So as length increases, the distance also increases. So let's see. That means we just have to compare P4 and P3's lengths and see which one has a greater length. So go to table 1 and we can see that P3 and P4. So P3 has a length of 1 and P4 has a length of 2, meaning that P4 will travel a greater distance over a cycle because it has a greater L, and that's going to be option choice C. All right, let's move on to question 24. Assume that if m is equal to 1 kilogram and L is equal to 1 meter, F will equal 0.5 cycles per second. Based on student 1 prediction, if m is 2 kilograms and L is 1 meter, F will most likely be. Okay, so this is very confusing. They just gave us a ton of numbers, arbitrary numbers, but the most important thing that we want to take away from this is that they're doubling m basically, and they're making L stay the same. So we just got to figure out what happens according to student 1 when mass is increasing, right? And we deduced that earlier in one of the earlier problems. If we go back to student 1, it says, for a given L, as mass increases, the gravitational force also increases. That means the weight increases and acceleration will increase, and also that results in increasing F, right? And F is equal to 0.5 cycles per second. And since the mass is greater for the 2 kilogram ball or whatever, that means F will also increase, meaning that it will be greater than 0.5 cycles per second. So that's option choice F. All right, let's move on to question 25. Consider the statements about F, M, and L given below. Oh, wow. Okay, so this is a lot. So let's tackle, so this is asking us, both students would most likely disagree, right, with which of these statements. So let's start with statement 1. The frequency F is affected by M, but not by L. So I think we can immediately disprove this because this is exactly what student 1 is arguing for, right? So student 1, if we go back, M increases, F increases, right? So as M increases, it's affecting F. So that agrees. But as L decreases, F remains the same. So that means M will affect F, but L will not. And that's exactly what statement 1 is saying. And we're asked to see which statements that both of the students would disagree with. So we can immediately cross out 1. And looking at the answer choices, that means we can cross off A and C because they both include 1. Now a neat trick you could also use here is instead of checking 2 or 3, you can actually just go ahead and check 4. Because if 4 is true, that means the answer has to be D. But if 4 is false, that means B has to be the answer. So we can actually just solve this problem by just checking 2 of the 4 statements instead of checking all 4 of them. So let's check statement 4. The frequency F is affected by neither M nor L. Immediately, student 1 would disagree with this, right? We know for a fact that student 1 said the frequency is going to be affected by M. So let's look at student 2. And student 2 says M will not affect M will not affect F, but as L increases, F will decrease. So student 2 believes that L will affect F, right? So that means both students believe that this statement is false and they disagree with it. So that means it's true, and that is one of the answers, meaning that D has to be the correct answer. All right, let's move on to question 26. Which of the two students, if either, would be likely to agree that as sphere mass increases, frequency will decrease? Okay, so let's look at student 1. So what we're trying to see is the relationship between mass and frequency. So student 1 believes that as mass increases, F will also increase, so frequency will increase. So that's false. So student 1 is not in agreement with this statement. So let's check student 2 now. And student 2 believes that mass will not affect F, right? So that he also disagrees with the statement, meaning that both students disagree, making J the correct answer. Neither students agree. All right, so I'm gonna put another passage up there. It's just gonna be 2 questions, but I want you guys to practice data identification and how you initially tackle really long and complicated passages. So I put it up there. Pause the video and try and solve it through first, or watch the walkthrough. So again, just like how we tackled the first passage, I'm not gonna read any of the text or graphs or whatever. I'm just gonna look at the first question. So question 34. The solution containing which of the following CTs absorbed green light at its lambda max? So you might not even know what the sign is or what it means, right? If you took physics, you know that means wavelength, right? And it's measured in nanometers. But you don't know what a CT is, and you don't really have any context about the problem. So now this is where we look into the passage to get the answer, right? So a really good way to identify where in the passage that you might find your answers by looking at the answer choices, right? So you can see that the answer choices contains what? Xanthan, beta-carotene, lycopene. Like, I have no idea what those are, right? But I can see that in table 1, it has those exact things along with lambda max, right? So I know table 1 is for sure going to be important. So take that in note. The other criteria that the question wants us to meet is which of them absorbed green light, right? So I'll look at the graph and I can see green, yellow, orange, red, violet, blue. So it's like a color wheel, right? And it's telling us between what ranges of nanometers, which is the wavelength, that each color falls into, right? So that this is telling us that anything between 480 to 560 will have green light. So boom, we can look at table 1 and we can see which ones will have green light at its lambda max, right? Which one will absorb green light at its lambda max. And we can see that only one of the answer choices falls into that category, and that's astaxanthin, which is 488, meaning that it absorbs green light at its lambda max. And you can see that the other ones don't work because they're they're below the 480 threshold. So that means J will be the correct answer. Let's move on to question 35. What percent of the volume of the CT solution prepared in step 1 was placed into a vial in step 2? So immediately we're looking for step 1, step 2, okay? So I can see that in under study, there's a step 1 and a step 2. So step 1 says the CT was dissolved in a certain solvent at whatever, not relevant, to make a 5 milliliter solution. So 5 milliliters, right? And it's asking what percent of the volume. So we know to look for milliliters, right? Now, compared to step 2, let's see what step 2 says. A 1 milliliter sample, right? So we're going from 5 milliliters to 1 milliliter. So it's literally asking what percent of 5 milliliters is 1 milliliter, and that's 20%. So the correct answer will be B, right? To answer these questions, I didn't have to read the whole passage, right? I didn't have to understand what the experiment was talking about. I just had to identify what the question was asking and where in the passage that answer lies. And it's very simple, right? You're basically simplifying the question from what percent of the volume of the CT solution to, what percent of 5 is 1, right? And that's 20%. All right, I'm going to put another passage up on the screen. Same procedure. So pause if you want to do it yourself or listen to the walkthrough. So same as always, skip the passage, go straight to the question. So question 13, what percent of the height of the tank was filled with sand? So we're looking for tank and sand. Those are key words. So let's skim the passage for tank and sand. And I can immediately spot it. Each of 20 identical tanks with 25 centimeter high glass walls was prepared as follow. First, sand was poured into the tank to a depth of 10 centimeters. So we're basically trying to find out what percent of 25 is 10, right? And we can just multiply both numbers by 4, and it's the same thing as what percent of 100 is 40, and that's just 40%. So that's going to be option choice B. All right, question 14. Which of the statements listed below describes a function of the fine wire mesh? Number 1, to place the whatever that is in a tank, to protect from attack by prey. Okay, so prey doesn't attack. All right, and then 3, to prevent that from leaving the tank. Okay, so let's read the study a little bit more in depth now. So it sees we're looking for fine wire mesh. Okay, so 3 one-year-old females were artificially fertilized, placed into the tank, and then on top of the tank, it was covered by a fine wire mesh. All right, so it doesn't tell us the reason, but let's read the rest of the study and see if we can infer the reason. All right, so group H, so they were split into 4 different groups, and they were incubated at different time periods at different temperatures. And that's the end of the study. So it has no mention of anything about prey, right? And the creature, whatever Stanciburiana, it was placed in the tank before the fine wire mesh, right? So that means 1 or 2 does not work. That means 3 is the only logical explanation to why the fine wire mesh was there, even though they don't explicitly say it, right? By scientific process, we know that we don't want the creature to leave its tank while conducting an experiment. So 3 would be the correct answer, and that's G. Let's move on to option choice 15. Assume that the greater an egg's mass, the healthier its embryo. Okay. Based on the results of the study among 4 temperatures, okay, when they were incubated in the dark, the temperature that was most likely resulted in the healthiest embryos on average was what? So health is equal to greater the egg's mass, right? So we're looking for the one with the biggest mass because that means it's the healthiest. And if we look at the table, we can see that group T had the biggest average egg mass. So let's look at what group T was incubated at. And above it, right, it says it right there. Group T was incubated in the dark at 29 degrees Celsius. So the answer is going to be D, 29 degrees Celsius. Let's move on to question 16. All right, is that creature a reptile or a mammal, and does it primarily maintain its body temperature by generating heat or by absorbing heat, right? So let's see. We need to figure out if it's a reptile or a mammal. So let's read. Usually at the beginning, they give a lot more context. So for these types of questions that asks generally, I would look at the first paragraph because it provides a bit of context to what the experiment is about. And we can see that environmental conditions, the reproduction of which is a species of lizard, right? And we know lizards are reptiles, right? And we know reptiles are cold-blooded. And when you're cold-blooded, you're absorbing heat, right? Mammals like us, right? You might not know, right, that a reptile absorbs heat or generates heat. But if you simplify and be like, okay, well, but what about mammals? Like, are we absorbing heat or are we generating heat? And you can feel your body and you're giving off temperature, right? So you're generating heat. So that means reptiles are the inverse and they're absorbing heat. So you might not know that reptiles absorb or generate heat at the top of your head, right? But if you think about it a little bit and apply it to, in a logical sense, you can easily figure out that reptiles are supposed to be absorbing heat. So that's option choice F, reptile absorbing heat from the surrounding environment. All right, so that's all the practice passages and questions that I had for today. I definitely say the best way to improve on any of the ACT subjects really is just by practicing, right? So do that free practice on the ACT website. Do those practice tests on the ACT book guide, right, which you can get for free online. You don't have to buy a physical copy. And just keep practicing, mark what you did wrong, and do it under actual time constraints of the test, right? Don't give yourself an hour to complete the section. Like, if it's 40 minutes, do it in 40 minutes. Like, get a timer out. You want to simulate real world testing conditions as best you can, so you can be as best prepared and trained for test day as possible. All right, so that's about gonna wrap it up for today's video. Hopefully I was able to help you and give you some new insight on the science section, and it was some good practice. If you have any questions, comments, or whatever, you can leave a comment in the comment section, or you can DM me on Instagram and I will get back to you. I mean, that's pretty much it. Keep your head up, keep practicing, and I wish you guys the best of luck.